Hello, I'm Annette Dubrouillet, and I am back. Yes, I had some major computer problems that took me several weeks to get straightened out, but I'm back, and I'm back to read The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. We're on chapter 21. And chapter 1 is entitled Ben Weatherstaff, who, remember, is the gardener that Mary first ran into out in the gardens. Chapter 21. One of the strange things about living in the world is that it is only now and then one is quite sure one is going to live forever and ever and ever. One knows it sometimes when one gets up at the tender solemn of dawnlight and goes out and stands alone and throws one's head far back and looks up and watches the pale sky slowly changing and flushing and marvelous unknown things happening until the east almost makes one cry out and one's heart stand still at the strange, unchanging majesty of the rising sun, which has been happening every morning for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. One knows it then for a moment or so, and one knows it sometimes when one stands by oneself in a wood at sunset, and the mysterious deep gold stillness slanting through and under the branches seems to be saying slowly again and again something one cannot quite hear, however much one tries. Then sometimes the immense quiet of the dark blue at night with millions of stars waiting and watching makes one sure. And sometimes a far off music makes it true, and sometimes a look in someone's eyes. And it was like that with Colin when he first saw and heard and felt springtime inside the 4 high walls of the hidden garden. That afternoon, the whole world seemed to devote itself to being perfectly and radiantly beautiful and kind to one boy. Perhaps out of pure heavenly goodness, the spring came and crowded everything it possibly could into that one place. More than once, Dickon paused in what he was doing and stood still with a sort of growing wonder in his eye, shaking his head softly. "Aye, it is greatly," he said. "I'm 12 going on 13, and there's a lot of afternoons in 13 years, but it seems to me like I never seed one as greatly as this here." "Aye, it is greatly one," said Mary, and she sighed for mere joy. "Oh, it's the greatliest one that was ever in this world." "D'ye think," said Colin, with his dreamy carefulness, "as happens it was made like this here all on purpose for me?" "My word," cried Mary admiringly, "that there is a bit of good Yorkshire. Thou art shaping first rate, thou art." And delight reigned. They drew the chair under the plum tree, which was snow white with blossoms and musical with bees. It was like a king's canopy, a fairy king's. There were flowering cherry trees near and apple trees whose buds were pink and white, and here and there one had burst open wide. Between the blossoming branches of the canopy, bits of blue sky looked down like wonderful eyes. Mary and Dickon worked a little here and there, and Colin watched them. They brought him things to look at, buds which were opening, buds which were tight closed, bits of twig whose leaves were just showing green, and the feather of a woodpecker that had dropped on the grass, the empty shell of some bird early hatched. Dickon pushed the chair slowly round and round the garden, stopping every other moment to let him look at wonders of spring out of the earth or trailing down from the trees. It was like being taken in state round the country of a magic king and queen and shown all the mysterious riches it contained. "I wonder if we shall see the robin," said Colin. "That'll seem often enough after a bit," answered Dickon. "When the eggs hatch and they're all out, the little chap you'll be keeping busy, it'll make his head swim. They'll see him flying back and forth and carrying worms nigh as big as himself, and that much noise going on in the nest where he gets there fair flustered him so as he scarce knows which mouth to drop the first piece in. and the gaping beaks and squawks on every side. Mother says as when she sees the works of a robin, has to keep 'em gaping beaks filled. She feels like she was a lady with nothing to do. She says she's seen the little chaps when they seem like the sweat must be dropping off, and though folks can't see it. This made them giggle so delightedly that they were obliged to cover their mouths with their hands, remembering that they must not be heard. Colin had been instructed as to the laws of whispers and low voices several days before. He liked the mysteriousness of it and did his best, but in the midst of excited enjoyment, it is rather difficult never to laugh above a whisper. Every moment of the afternoon was full of new things, and every hour the sunshine grew more golden. The wheeled chair had been drawn back under the canopy, and Dickon had sat down on the grass and had just drawn out his pipe when Colin saw something he had not had time to notice before. "That's a very old tree over there, isn't it?" he said. Dickon looked across the grass at the tree, and Mary looked, and there was a brief moment of stillness. "Yes," said Dickon after it, and his voice was low and had a very gentle sound. Mary gazed at the tree and thought, "The branches are quite gray. There's not a single leaf anywhere." Colin went on, "It's quite dead, isn't it?" "Aye," admitted Dickon, "but them roses as had climbed all over it will nearly hide every bit of the dead wood when they're full of leaves and flowers. It won't look dead then. It'll be the prettiest of all." Mary still gazed at the tree and thought, "It looks as if a big branch had broken off," said Colin. "I wonder how it was done." "That's been done many a year," answered Dickon. "Aye." With a sudden relieved start and laying his hand on Colin, he said, "Look at that robin. There he is. He's been foraging for his mate." Colin was almost too late, but he caught sight of him, the flash of the red-breasted bird with something in its beak. He darted through the greenness and into the close ground corner and was out of sight. Colin leaned back on his cushion, laughing a little. "He's taking her tea, I suppose. Perhaps it's 5 o'clock. I think I'd like some tea myself." And so they were safe. "It was magic what sent the robin," said Mary secretly to Dickon afterward. "I know it was magic." For both she and Dickon had been afraid Colin might ask something about the tree whose branch had broken off 10 years ago, and they had talked it over together, and Dickon had stood and rubbed his head in a troubled way. "Well, Mum, look as if there were nothing at the other trees," he had said. "We couldn't never tell him how it broke, poor lad. If he says anything about it, we mun try to look cheerful." "Aye, that we mun," had answered Mary. But she had not felt as if she looked cheerful when she gazed at the tree. She wondered and wondered if in those moments there had been any reality in that other thing Dickon had said. Had he gone on rubbing his rust-red hair in a puzzled way, but a nice comforted look had begun to grow in his blue eyes. "Mrs. Craven was a very young, lovely lady," he had gone on rather hesitatingly. "Aye, Mother thinks she may have been about Misselthwaite many a time, looking after Mr. Collins, same as old mothers do when they're out in the world. They have to come back and say, 'Happen she's been in the garden and happened to set her work there and told us to bring him here.'" Drink. Mary had thought he meant something about magic. She was a great believer in magic. Secretly, she quite believed that Dickon worked magic, and of course good magic, on everything near him. And that was why people liked him so much. And wild creatures knew he was their friend. She wondered indeed if it were not possible that his gift had brought the robin just at the right moment when Colin asked that dangerous question. She felt like his magic was working all afternoon and making Colin look like an entirely different boy. It did not seem possible that he could be the crazy creature who had screamed and beaten and bitten his pillow. Even his ivory whiteness seemed to change. The faint glow of color which had shone on his face and neck and hands when he first got inside the garden really never quite died away. He looked as if he were made of flesh instead of ivory or wax. They saw the robin carrying food to his mate 2 or 3 times, and it was so suggestive of afternoon tea that Colin felt they must have some. "Go and make one of the men servant bring Bring some in a basket to the rhododendron walk, he said, and then you and Dickon can bring it here. It was an agreeable idea, easily carried out, and when the white cloth was spread on the grass, the hot tea and buttered toast and crumpets were a delightfully hungry meal was eaten. Several birds on a domestic errand passed to inquire what was going on and were led to investigating crumbs with great activity. Nut and Shell whisked up trees with pieces of cake, and Soot took the entire half of a buttered crumpet in a corner and pecked and examined and turned it over and made hoarse remarks about it until he decided to swallow it all joyfully in one gulp. The afternoon was dragging towards its mellow hour. The sun was deepening the gold of its lances, the bees were going home, and the birds were flying past less often. Dickon and Mary were sitting on the grass. The tea basket was repacked, ready to be taken back to the house, and Colin was lying against his cushion with his heavy locks pushed back from his forehead and his face looking quite a natural color. "I don't want this afternoon to go," he said, "but I shall come back tomorrow and the day after and the day after and the day after." "You'll get plenty of fresh air, won't you?" said Mary. "I'm going to get nothing else," he answered. "I've seen the spring now, and I'm going to see the summer. I'm going to see everything grow here. I'm going to grow here myself." Thou will," said Dickon. "Us'll have thee walking about here as digging same as other folk afore long." Colin flushed tremendously. "Walk?" he said. "Dig? Shall I?" Dickon's glance at him was delicately curious and cautious. Neither he nor Mary had ever asked if anything was matter with his legs. "For sure thou will," he said stoutly. "Thou got legs of thy own, same as other folk." Mary was frightened until she heard Colin's answer. "Nothing really ails them," he said, "but they are so thin and weak. They shake so that I'm afraid to stand on them." Both Mary and Dickon drew a relieved breath. "When thou stop being afraid, thou shalt stand on 'em," Dickon said with renewed cheer, "and thou shalt stop being afraid after a bit." "I shall?" said Colin, and he lay still as if he were wondering about things. They were really very quiet for a little while. The sun was dropping lower. It was that hour when everything stills itself, and they really had a busy and exciting afternoon. Colin looked as if he were resting luxuriously. Even the creatures had ceased moving about and had drawn together and were resting near them. Soot had perched on a low branch and drawn up one leg and dropped the gray film drowsily over his eye. Mary privately thought he looked as if he might snore in a minute. In the midst of the stillness, it was rather startling when Colin half lifted his head and examined it in a loud, alarmed whisper. "Who is that man?" Dickon and Mary scrambled to their feet. "Man!" They both cried in low, quick voices. Colin pointed to a high wall. "Look!" he whispered excitedly. "Just look!" Mary and Dickon wheeled about and looked. There was Ben Weatherstaff's indignant face glaring at them from over the top of the ladder. He actually shook a fist at Mary. "If I weren't a bachelor and that weren't a little wretch of mine," he cried, "I'd give thee a hiding." He mounted another step threateningly, as if he were his energetic intention to jump down and deal with her. But as she came toward him, he evidently thought better of it and stood on the top of the stepladder, shaking his fist down at her. "I never throw much of thee," he harangued. "I couldn't abide thee first time I set eyes on thee. A scrawny, buttermilk-faced young besom, always asking questions and poking about with that nose." Excuse me. "I never know how that got so thick with me. If that hadn't for that robin, drat him." "Ben Weatherstaff," called out Mary, finding her breath. She stood below him and called up to him in a sort of gasp. "Ben Weatherstaff, it was the robin that showed me the way in." Then it didn't seem as if Ben really would scramble down on her side of the wall. He was so outraged. "That young'un," he called down at her, "laying that badness on down the robin, but none but is impudent enough for any him showing they away. That young nut." She could see his next words burst out of his because he was overpowered by curiosity. However, how in this world did that get in? It was the robin who showed me the way, she protested obstinately. He didn't know he was doing it, but he did. And I can't tell you from here why you're shaking your fist at me. He dropped his shaking fist very suddenly at that very moment, and his jaw actually dropped as he stared over her head and he saw something coming over the grass toward him. At the first sound of his torrent of words, Colin had been so surprised that he had only sat up and listened as if he were spellbound. But in the midst of it, he had recovered himself and beckoned imperiously to Dickon. "Wheel me over there," he commanded. "Wheel me quite close and stop right in front of him." And this, if you please, this is what Ben Weatherstaff beheld and made his jaw drop. A wheeled chair with luxurious cushions and robes which came toward him looking rather like some sort of state coach because a young Rajah leaned back in it with royal command in his great black-rimmed eyes and thin white hand extended haughtily toward him. And it stopped right under Ben Weatherstaff's nose. It really was no wonder his mouth dropped open. "Do you know who I am?" demanded the Rajah. How Ben Weatherstaff stared. His red old eyes fixed themselves on what was before him as if he were seeing a ghost. He gazed and gazed and gulped a lump down his throat and did not say a word. "Do you know who I am?" demanded Colin still more imperiously. "Answer!" Ben Weatherstaff put his gnarled hand up and passed it over his eyes and over his forehead, and then did he answer in a queer, shaky voice. "Oh, he said. That I do with a mother's eyes staring at me out of that face. Lord knows how thou come here, but thou art that poor cripple." Colin forgot that he had ever had a back. His face flushed scarlet and he sat bolt upright. "I am not a cripple," he cried out furiously. "I'm not." "He's not?" cried Mary, almost shouting up the wall at her fierce indignation. He's not got a lump as big as a pin. And look, there was none there, not one." Ben Weatherstaff passed his hand over his forehead again and gazed as if he could never gaze enough. His hand shook and his mouth shook and his voice shook. He was an ignorant old man and a tactless old man, and he could only remember the things that he had heard. That hasn't got a crooked back," he said hoarsely. "No!" shouted Colin. That hasn't got crooked legs," quavered Ben more hoarsely yet. It was too much. The strength with which Colin usually threw into his tantrums rushed through him now in a new way. Never yet had he been accused of crooked legs, even in whispers, and the perfectly simple belief in their existence which was revealed in Ben Weatherstaff's voice was more than Rajah flesh and blood could endure. His anger and insulted pride made him forget everything but in this one moment, and filled him with a power he had never known before, an almost unnatural strength. "Come here," he shouted to Dickon. He actually began to tear the coverings off his lower limbs and disentangle himself. Come here, this minute." Dickon was by his side in a second. Mary caught her breath in a short gasp and felt herself turn pale. "He can do it! He can do it! He can do it! He can!" She gabbled over to herself under her breath as fast as she ever could. There was a brief, fierce scramble. The rugs were tossed to the ground. Dickon held Colin's arm. The thin legs were out. The thin legs were on the grass. And Colin was standing upright. Upright, as straight as an arrow and looking strangely tall. His head thrown back, and his strange eyes flashing lightning. "Look at me," he flung at Ben Weatherstaff. "Just look at me, you! Just look at me!" "He's as straight as I am," cried Dickon. "He's as straight as any lad in Yorkshire." What Ben Weatherstaff did, Mary thought queer beyond measure. He choked and gulped, and suddenly tears ran down his weather-wrinkled cheeks as he struck his old hands together. "Aye," he burst forth, "the lies folks tell, Thou art as thin as a lath, and that white as wraith, but there's not a knob on 'em. That'll make 'em moan yet. God bless ye." Dickon held Colin's arm strongly, but the boy had not begun to falter. He stood straighter and looked Ben Weatherstaff in the face. "I'm your master," he said, "when my father is away, and you are to obey me. This is my garden. Don't dare to say a word about it. You get down from that ladder, go out along the long walk, and Miss Mary will meet you and bring you here. I want to talk to you. We do not want you, but now you will have to be in on the secret. Be quick." Ben Weatherstaff Crabbe's old face was still wet with that one queer rush of tears. It seemed as if he could not take his eyes from the thin, straight Colin standing on his feet with his head thrown back. "Aye, lad," he almost whispered. "Aye, my lad." And then, remembering himself, he suddenly touched his hat gardener's fashion and said, "Yes, sir, yes, sir," and obediently disappeared as he descended the ladder. That's the end of an exciting chapter, isn't it? The end of chapter 21 of The Secret Garden. Can't wait to see what happens in chapter 22.